Alright, this is Spectrum's pre-production, our final presentation. I'm James Harbison, designer. Our second designer was Christopher Wolf.
Matt Gibson, programmer.
And Andrew Seba, programmer.
Alright, so we're going to begin by describing the project. So, what is Spectrum? Spectrum is a game that asks three questions. What if the player could not see the enemies in their environment? What if they had to piece together their own environment just to be able to navigate through it? And what if the choices that they made in this game mattered? So what we ultimately settled on was a first-person shooter stealth hybrid. You can think of games such as Dishonored or Deus Ex. It's going to be built primarily for the PC. The player will have the option to play it with a VR headset. We don't really know what the state of VR is going to be years from now if this project does go through production. So we're just kind of planning ahead. It's a game that focuses on story, immersion, and atmosphere. And by doing so, we're trying to create a cohesive experience between our gameplay and our story. So we'll start off by going into detail on the gameplay. So when we were trying to get inspiration for how this game is going to play, one of the first images that we came across is the image you see on the right, where you see this environment where out in the distance you have this atmosphere that's so thick you can't really see anything. So we thought about giving the player these vision modes that they would be able to use to reveal objects through this dense atmosphere. So the player will normally only be able to see a certain distance in front of them. And this created a lot of potential for interesting puzzles. And then we started asking, what if enemies were filled in this environment as well? How would that impact gameplay? And we really like the idea of making it stealth, because when we were doing research into what makes a great stealth game, most of the responses we read were focused on tension, that feeling of being just a foot or two away from your enemy at all times. So eventually the project evolved into this stealth action puzzle focused hybrid. And one of the main aspects of it is the fact that the player will be able to choose how they play. So the player will be able to go through each level and determine whether or not they want to kill all the enemies in the environment the quick and easy way, or use stealth to try to move around them without killing them. So when we were thinking about how the player's mechanics were going to run, we wanted the game to feel familiar to players who are used to playing first-person games. So you have your typical running, crouching, jumping, and shooting. But we do have that added element of these vision modes that the player will be able to cycle through in order to reveal objects through this fog. And again, the player will be able to approach the game in two separate ways. They can take the action approach and focus on using weapons to eliminate all the enemies in the environment, or use stealth to knock them out and take the quieter approach. The player will also have two different types of equipment at their disposal. They'll have stealth items that they'll be able to use for distracting those enemies to get past them without alerting them, as well as weapons for attacking them. So for our vision modes, we ended up settling on 7 total. This was inspired by the electro-magnetic spectrum. We liked the variety that each of these visions gave us, and each one's going to highlight different objects within the environment. So the ones we have listed here, we start off with our normal vision. This is just regular eyesight. You're not going to be able to see anything through the fog. And we have our heat vision, which will highlight any objects that are producing heat. So this would be useful for finding enemies because they emit body heat, as well as powered objects such as generators or engines, which could be used for puzzles. Third one is our black light vision, which is primarily used for seeing fluids throughout the environment. So it's going to be really useful for tracking blood trails of enemies that you've been able to wound, as well as finding hidden messages throughout the levels. that can give you hints how to solve each of these puzzles. Fourth one is our sound vision. It's pretty much exactly how it sounds. The player would be able to see objects through the fog that is emitting any type of sound at all. So this would be useful for things like walkie-talkies on enemies, as well as other puzzle-related machines that can be used. Our next one is motion. Also exactly like it sounds. The player would be able to spot any objects through the fog that is currently moving. It's mainly going to be just enemies and the occasional moving machines for puzzles. Next one is our X-ray vision. The players will be able to see through certain objects in the environment, so they'll be able to track where enemies move around behind cover. But this is only really going to work with thin objects, so it gives us more of leeway to be able to give the player and enemies a way to block themselves from being spotted. And then our last one is gamma ray vision. This is more of a end game vision mode that kind of combines a combination of all of them. It's just going to allow the player to see any objects through the fog at all. Now we'll move on to our enemies. We settled on 6 total enemy types. Each one has its own unique vision and weapon that it uses. Enemies themselves won't be able to cycle through visions like the player does. They'll only have one vision that they'll be able to use at a time, and this is just going to simplify the game for our player to be able to combat these enemies. So the way the enemies behave is they typically patrol through their environment like you would normally find within a stealth game. And if they happen to spot the player, through whatever vision mode they have, they would begin to attack. If the player attacks an enemy, the enemy will drop stealth items or ammo for weapons based on how the player takes them down. So if you're taking more of a stealth approach, you'll get stealth items dropped from those enemies. As opposed to taking the more action approach and killing the enemy, you get all of their weapons and ammo. So our 6 types are listed. We have a rusher. That one is, more of the bottom of the hierarchy. He doesn't really have a special vision mode. He's forced to use a melee weapon, and the way to get around that enemy is mainly to just stay out of their sight and avoid getting close to them, because they will charge you if they spot you. And the next one is Ranger. This one can see your body heat through the fog. They have more of a longer range weapon, so the player has to be much more focused on what direction the enemy's facing in order to avoid being killed by them. Next one's the Suppressor. This one has black light, so they're going to be able to spot your blood trail if you are wounded, and moving throughout the environment, you're leaving a trail for them to follow. That will eventually lead to your spot. The next one is the Inferno. This is more of our flame-themed enemy type, but they'll be able to spot you by using sound. So the way to combat this enemy type is to move throughout the environment quietly. So you'll want to crouch down while moving and move slowly in order to avoid being spotted by them. Next one's our Deadeye enemy. This one, he's our very long range enemy type. He'll be able to spot you whenever you're moving. So the way to combat this one is to quickly move from cover to cover to avoid being spotted by them. And they'll be equipped with a sniper rifle, so they'll be able to take you out from long distance. And then our last one is our Engineer. This one's more of a healing type enemy, and that'll be encountered later in the game. They'll have X-ray vision to be able to see you through the fog, and they'll rush you similar to what a rusher does. They have a short-range shotgun type weapon. And they will be moving around the environment, bringing any wounded or knocked out enemies back to full health. So when we were thinking about levels for our game, we settled down on 13 total levels. 2 of those are optional. There's going to be a couple of points throughout the game where the player will be able to choose what paths to take, which means they will end up avoiding playing certain levels, and it's going to add replayability to the game later on to be able to go back through and play the levels that you didn't choose the first time around. When we were thinking about how to set up these levels, we were taking more of an arena-style approach, similar to what you find in games like the Halo series, where you have these larger areas that are filled with enemies and puzzles, and the player will have multiple ways to take them down. And each of these areas are kind of connected by smaller pathways to separate them from each other. Throughout the level, you'll find hints that are left behind. The player won't know who is leaving behind these hints quite yet. We'll get back to that part later when we talk about our story. At the end of every level, the player will transition to the next one by selecting the next from the map. So as we were talking before about how our player would have to occasionally choose one of multiple levels to take, they'll be able to select it from that menu. And this is going to allow the player to be more immersed in our game. It's going to give them this feeling of being able to travel from one end of this actual environment to the next, and it's going to add replay value to our game. By allowing the player to replay any level at any point, so the player will be able to backtrack if they choose, which is going to, again, add immersion into our game world. And within these levels, ammo is going to be scarce, so what it's going to do is entice the player to really think about how they're going to take down their next enemy, and those weapons and that quick and easy route of taking enemies down is going to entice them to want to kill players more, which is going to work in favor of our story later on. So now we'll get into our story now. So when we were thinking about how to set up this story, we were wondering what kind of stories could naturally arise from gameplay like this, and we were trying to figure out ways of explaining each of these gameplay features. So what we ultimately settled on was a science fiction story. We are going to explain our fog being a toxic atmosphere on an alien planet, and these enemies that you're going to choose whether or not to kill or spare are simply just people within this planet that are just kind of stuck there, and they're all just trying to survive. So it's going to add a stronger emphasis on morality within our game. The way it's being set up is that the player was sent to this planet to fix this toxic atmosphere, but instead was captured by these enemies and is trying to basically figure out what is going on. But what we wanted to do was add a bigger twist to our game. So we came up with this supernatural aspect to our story. What if our game world was actually in the afterlife, and this entire situation has been crafted to test your morality, and whatever actions you take within this trial is going to ultimately decide how the game ends. So this is the background to our story. If we're taking this from a sci-fi perspective, space travel's been invented, and humanity is kind of reaching out to the stars and colonizing all of these other planets and terraforming them to their needs to make them habitable. On the planet that this game takes place on, the terraforming has malfunctioned, which has created the toxic atmosphere that the player is now finding themselves in. And again, each of these colonists that were on the planet that make up our enemies are simply trapped there and doing everything they can to just try and survive. But when we look at this from a supernatural perspective, again, the player has died, they are in the afterlife, and some type of unknown force is creating this situation to test how they're going to react when thrown into darker situations. What this is going to do is allow us to have multiple endings and set up a way to have the player interpret the story on their own and really decide what really happened. Is this sci-fi planet real, or was the player simply imagining it all? So now we will dive into our characters. We have 4 main characters in our story. Our protagonist is Daniel. He's the hero of our story, and he is a character who is running from his past. He was abused by his father as a child, and that memory still haunts him to this day. He's kind of just been on the run ever since. Now it is in the future, and the character is older. He's out on his own. He's working for this company that builds these terraforming equipment, and he is being sent to this planet to fix it after the terraforming malfunctioned. The second character is Killian, which is the character's father, but the way this character is represented in the game is more of a memory. So imagine it similar to a character such as the Joker in Batman Arkham Knight. The character isn't really there, but their memory is still commenting on the events that are happening. Our third character is our escapee. This character is meant to be the real version of our character's father, who has been in the afterlife, and he is stuck there, and he thinks the only way he can move on is to right his wrongs and help his son through this situation. And then our final character is Nalda, who has been leading these colonists through this terrible situation to try to get them to survive, and she reflects Daniel's father's character by having a similar past. So one of the important aspects of morality within our game is our hint system. As we mentioned earlier, we were going to have hints scattered throughout each level, and each of these hints are left behind by Killian and the escapee, which is both the memory of his father and Daniel's actual father. And what these hints are trying to do is sway the player to do good or bad decisions within each of the areas that they are found. So if the player goes into an area and finds a hint, one might mention the only way to get through is to kill an enemy, or another one might mention the only way to get through is to avoid an enemy. And this is supposed to represent the angel and devil on our shoulders that Daniel is trying to face while in this situation. So the way we have the plot set up, for the first act, the game is going to begin with a flashback sequence that introduces our main character as well as his father. And this is supposed to be a memory and a nightmare of him as a child running away. And it's supposed to teach mechanics. But ultimately, the player is going to wake up from this nightmare. It's going to be present day. He's going to be aboard the ship and eventually land on the planet with his allies to go into this environment and fix these terraforming machines. Eventually, the player and his allies are going to be captured. And this is where we're first introduced to Nalda's character for the first time. And she reveals her plan to take their ship that is currently in a different location. So the game itself becomes this race to the ship between both sides, because the player eventually is going to escape from being captured and be out in the world on his own, trying to make it to the ship before Nalda and her crew do. The second act of our game is really where the morality side of our game starts to kick in. Daniel ends up discovering that his allies have been held in certain locations, and he's going to attempt to save them and to try to travel to the ship together. But what he finds out is that these two allies are separated from each other, and this is where we come to the point where the player has to choose which level to take that we mentioned earlier when we were talking about level selection. the player can take one path, try to save one character, or another path and try to save another. But both are ultimately going to end the same way, in that he ends up being too late and both characters are dead. The next 3 levels, the player gets introduced to our escapee character, and he finds out he's been leaving these hints behind. But this escapee does not reveal his true identity of being his father until the very end of our game. And also through these levels, the player will learn more of our backstory and history of our game world, so they have a better understanding of what is going on. But eventually, the player reaches a second choice. He finds the last 2 remaining allies, and he thinks this is his chance to redeem himself by failing to save the last 2. But again, he has to choose which one to save, and he ends up being crushed by the fact that both of them are already dead as well. And then we end up with our final act. So at this point, Daniel has lost all of his allies. He's out on his own. He's out for revenge, and this is starting to have our character spiral down a dark path, where eventually he reaches the ship, and we have our final boss between Nalda and him. Eventually that final boss is going to create a decision whether or not the player should kill Nalda or save her. And during that situation, the escapee ends up intervening, and you end up learning that he is your deceased father and his soul is trapped, which will eventually lead to our epilogue. Our epilogue is set up with one of 2 outcomes. One is, well, they both start off by having the player awake as a child. We don't know whether or not the player is dreaming or if this is actually real, and the situation he was in was a dream. So what the player does is that he has to choose whether or not to forgive his father after taking a walk in his shoes and being introduced to situations that he had to go through earlier in his life that led to his abusive actions when Daniel was a child. The game does only have 2 outcomes, but the player will end up creating multiple by being able to interpret this outcome in one of many ways. We don't really know what really happened. The player could have dreamt this whole situation and he was a kid all along, or he could have actually been in the afterlife and this is all real. And finally, we'll get to our user interface. So when we were creating the UI for our game, we wanted everything to keep the player immersed within our game world. So every menu screen in our game is meant to be an extension of the player's heads-up display. We want the player to always feel like they are wearing that visor so that they never end up breaking immersion within our world. So the screens that we have set up, we currently have our main menus, pause menus, etc., the heads-up display, and then our level selection screen, which will be at the end of every level. So we'll begin with our menus. We have 2 main types of menus. We have our main menu screen that the player will be able to go through and decide whether or not to play an old game, load up a new one, play a new one, load up an old one, tweak their settings, quit, etc. But what was interesting about an idea that we had was to create it in a 3D environment so that the player will be able to cycle through vision modes within this menu and sort of reveal Easter eggs that will change based on what level you're currently at within the story. And then we'll have our pause menu that the player will be able to stop the game at any point, take a break, so on, and they'll be able to go back to the main menu if they want, load up a pre-existing save, quit, etc., just like the main menu. And here we have an example of what the main menu would look like. So this is from the first person perspective, as if the player was in-game. But each of the different buttons within the menu show off exactly like their heads-up display would. And the player will be able to turn their head, look around. If the game is being played in a VR headset, the player will be able to control what direction they're looking around in a VR headset as well. Now we'll move on to our heads-up display. There are 5 main aspects of our HUD. First is our compass at the top. This is going to be very useful for allowing the player to navigate through the environment. When the environment's covered in thick fog, it's going to be pretty easy for the player to get lost about what direction they're heading in. Then we have our spectrum and equipment bars. These they're going to function similarly and show off what their currently selected vision mode and equipment item is. And whenever the player ends up changing either of those, they'll be updated to display the most current information. Then we have our health bar at the bottom of the screen, pretty standard health bar that ends up displaying the player's current state of health. If the bar gets down too low, the bar will flash red, so on and so forth, like you typically find within a game. And then our last aspect is our selection wheel, which will be called on whenever the player wants to change whatever their current vision type or equipment is. And here's an example of our weapon wheel. So this is going to show off how the player is going to select a new weapon. This wheel would appear when the correct button is pressed, and the player will be able to cycle through each of these different weapons and stealth items. And in the lower right hand part of the screen, that image will be updated to show off whatever your current selected one is. And then similar to the weapon wheel, we have the spectrum wheel, which functions the same way but is used for changing your vision mode. Then we move on to how our level selection works. At the end of every level, the player is going to be able to select what next level they wish to play. Each of these levels are represented by nodes on a map, and each of these nodes are a different facility within this environment. So the player is going to be moving from one facility to the next to be able to track their progress through the game and always know how many more levels they have left. This is going to immerse the player within our game world by making them feel like they're actually traveling from one end of this environment to another. And like we've stated before, the player is occasionally going to have a choice between which of 2 levels they wish to play. So this is what our level selection screen looks like. Throughout the environment, you'll see each of those nodes, which represent facilities, and occasionally you'll see branching paths, which show off our choices that the player will be able to go through and select one of 2 options when having to decide which level to play next. And now we'll transition over to our demo to show off all of this gameplay and idea in progress. So we're going to begin by showing off the first 2 levels of our demo. The final version of our demo has 3 levels in it, so we encourage everybody to check out the last level and play it for themselves. Here we have our main menu, which, like we stated before, is actually a 3D environment. The player is able to change vision modes within this environment, as well as being able to decide whether or not they want to load a pre-existing game or play a new one. So we'll go ahead and dive in. Pressing play sends us to our level selection screen where the player will be able to launch our first level. So here we are aboard our ship. The 3 levels that we have in our demo are actually our 2nd, 3rd, and 4th level, so we decided to skip over the prologue here. So the player is starting out aboard this ship. Looks like we have a data pad on the floor. We'll go over and we'll activate it. Now for the sake of this demo, we treated these messages like tutorials, but in the final game, these messages would be used for hints, like we mentioned earlier within our presentation. These hints are going to make you decide whether or not to take a good or bad route within each of the areas that you come across. So what we're going to do, we're going to explore through this ship, activate each of these tutorial messages. Each one's going to describe exactly what buttons are used within our demo and just generally teach the player how to play. Here we're showing off our vision modes for the first time. As we cycle through each of them, the player is able to view the environment in a different way. Of course, aboard this ship there is no fog, so the player won't exactly see any highlighted objects off in the distance. This one's teaching the player how to use the menu screens. And the end of our tutorial section here aboard the ship ends across the hall in that airlock, but we'll go down this hallway and finish up the rest of these tutorials. Here we're introducing the player to our weapons for the first time. The player's going to walk over and pick up that pistol. It now displays and highlights within our weapon wheel for the player to be able to select it. We'll head over into the next room and practice using it. Always have to remember to put some ammo in that weapon. It'd be very bad to go out in that environment and not have anything to shoot with. Now we'll head off into that airlock and start our demo. So the player has exited the ship. He is now outside in the environment on his own. As you can see, the fog in action really breaks the player's ability to see in a certain distance, so we're cycling through our vision modes now in order to get a better look of what's off in the distance. It looks like we found another data pad. We'll turn it on. We're going to introduce the player how to hurdle, as well as our key cards for our objective. So we're going to turn around, we're going to pick up that key card. We'll need it later. And we'll show off this hurdle mechanic. We wanted to add verticality into our environments, so we figured a hurdle mechanic to allow the player to climb onto objects was a good idea. Allows the player to hide above enemies instead of just behind cover. I found another data pad, we'll turn it on. And we collected that key card, so that switch should work now. We'll jump onto this moving platform and it will take us across this pit. If the player had fallen into the pit, he would have been killed. This is showing off one of the simpler puzzle types within our game. Alright, we made it through there. Now we're going to head out forward. You saw the saving icon show up. Our demo does have a checkpoint system, and each of those saves will show up to be able to load from the main menu whenever the player wishes to revisit a prior area within our game. So it looks like we came across another structure. Turn on this data pad to figure out what it is. This is an example of one of our hint messages. Up until this point, we have mostly been showing off tutorials, but the way that hints will be shown off within our game is going to look similar to that. So now we're in this facility. We'll figure out what we have to do next. So it looks like we have to collect all of these fuses and showing our weapon wheel off shows off our inventory. So as the player moves around and collects each of these fuses, they show up within our inventory so the player can track exactly how many they have. Our objectives show that we needed 4 fuses. Looks like we have all 4. We'll head upstairs. Trying to turn the power back on. We've reactivated the door. Now we've reached the end of this facility. And as we mentioned earlier, every level is going to end by the player being able to select the next level that they wish to play. So over there on the table is the map showing off. And we have transitioned to our level selection screen, and now it shows off the second facility that we'll be moving towards. So just to bridge the gap between what has happened between the first and second level, at the end of the first level that we just played, the player would have been knocked out after the power in the facility had gone back out, and the player is now been captured, and he'll have to break out of this facility. Here we are showing off our takedown mechanics. So when we go over to approach that enemy, we'll have 2 choices of whether or not to spare him or kill him. In this case, we'll go ahead and kill him. And he ends up leaving a little bit of ammo for us. So as we mentioned earlier, killing an enemy will end up dropping more weapons for you to use, and knocking out an enemy will give you more stealth items. So it allows the player to continue to sustain whatever style of play they wish to use when going through this environment. So as we see here, we have our next objective. We're going to have to collect 5 key cards in order to get into our last facility. So we'll venture out into the environment. We're armed now, and this place is going to be filled with enemies, so we'll have to watch our back. Here we're showing off our heat vision mode. As you can see, it highlights each of our enemies through the fog because they're all giving off body heat. We don't know where each of these 5 key cards are located, so it's always going to be a good idea to explore every environment you're in. And it looks like we found one to our right there. Go ahead and pick up that first one. Now we have 4 more to go. So in that case, we use stealth to get past that enemy instead of using our weapon like we did to take down the first enemy. The player will have this choice throughout the entire game, but different situations are going to make it easier or more difficult in order to get past by using each of these playstyles. Search through here, make sure none of those enemies get us. Took down him, we have 1 more to go. picked up some pistol ammo from that dead enemy. And now we have 2 cards. So we'll continue down through this canyon space, onto the next area. Collect the rest of those key cards. We just hit another checkpoint. It looks like we've got another data pad on the ground. There's an elevator at the end of this. Might as well go check it out. Now, as you can see displayed in our upper right, each of our weapons have a very limited amount of ammo, so the player has to think twice about when using it. We'll try to get past these guards using some stealth. We've reached the elevator. Just have to make sure this enemy doesn't spot us. Now's our shot. We jumped on it and we're going up. And our 3rd key card is up on this bridge. So now we have 3. We'll head out into the final area to collect the remaining 2. And that enemy dropped a health pack, so our player will be able to replenish their health, but we have more than enough at this point. Don't really need it. We're just going to go ahead and remind the player at this point that they have to get 5 cards. They currently have 3, so there has to be 2 in this final area. This one's a little bit tricky. And he's attacking us. As you can see, the screen flashes red when our player is being attacked, and our health bar in the upper left has been updated to show a reduced amount of health. What we showed off right there, our health reduced enough to the point where our player died. So what we have done now is restarted our level at our last checkpoint, which saved just before we encountered that enemy. So we'll go through this one more time. All of our unlocked weapons and each of their ammo amounts have all been saved in those checkpoints, so the player never has to worry about backtracking to recollect anything. That enemy's proving to be difficult to take down.
I wasn't even the same enemy.
We're going to try to take him down with some stealth here. And we got him. He won't be bothering us anymore. head back up that elevator, recollect that third key card, and then head back out into the final area. Now we have our 3 key cards. We'll head back out into that last area.
Now, there is a known bug right now with the spectrum switching after you die, where the fog doesn't always return properly. That is one thing that we are needing to fix. We have not gotten to it by the time that our deadline hit because of some of the other things that we had to get in place first.
Those enemies can be easy to lose track of as playing through this demo. Always have to keep an eye out on where they are. Cycle through those vision modes. We've got 4 key cards selected at this point. We should only have 1 more left. Just have to avoid this last enemy here.
Too scared to go out. They're relentless. Here this enemy has ended up dropping off a new weapon type that we haven't encountered yet. So now the player has an assault rifle at his disposal.
stronger the weapon, the easier it is, and the quicker it is to take down each of these enemies. A weapon like the shotgun is going to require the player to get really close, as opposed to a weapon with range like the assault rifle. Saw a quick shot on the ground there. Now our player drops blood trails whenever they're shot and wounded. Here we've encountered another new weapon, our Gatling gun. There's our blood trail down there on the terrain. Different enemy types will be able to track that blood trail and know where we're at. Head back through this wall. Try to collect that final key card again. Looks like we got it. So now we have all 5 key cards in our inventory. We're going to try to avoid this pit in the middle of the terrain here and make our way to the end of this level. Just have to keep an eye out on those enemies, make sure none of them are following us. Go ahead and activate this door. Checkpoint has saved. Looks like we have one more area left to go. Now, as you play through the game, more enemy types are going to show up. So the player is going to have to create new strategies for taking down each of these new enemy types. So in this area, we treat it more of like an introductory mini type of boss battle that the player will be able to start getting introduced to our Ranger class. Up until this point, they've only played against rushers. We'll go through this one with a shotgun. The Ranger class ends up with heat vision mode, so they'll be able to spot our body heat from a distance, as opposed to the rushers that we've encountered up to this point, who only have normal vision. So we keep an eye on this guy, take him down when he's not looking in our direction. As new enemy types are introduced to the player, they're going to be tougher to take down. So we'll restart back at this checkpoint, head back through, see if the second try can help.
Again, we would normally have fog right now. This is a known issue that we have that we're trying to work out how to fix.
And his stealth approach proved much easier this time around. We'll head through this canyon space, see if we can find that map, so we can end the level.
Celebration.
Alright, and that was the demo for Spectrum. We'll head back over to our presentation. I hope everybody is able to play through the game and check it out. There is a third level within our demo, so we hope you all enjoy it, and can't wait to hear everybody's thoughts on the idea.